When the word Africa is mentioned, it often brings to mind an impoverished and underdeveloped region. However, this perception is no longer entirely accurate. Africa is progressively transforming to a land full of innovation and technological progress. In our latest episode, we will delve into contrasting views of Bitcoin in Europe and Africa, exploring why Bitcoin is becoming a powerful catalyst for financial revolution. Moreover, we will discuss how Bitcoin is opening new possibilities for individuals and communities, enabling them to access the global financial system. Could Africa potentially play a significant role in shaping the future of Bitcoin? This is a question we will explore in today's episode of Kryptoplebs with Tim Akinbo.
Hey guys, this is our first interview in English. We are at Pizza Day in Paralympolis in Prague, and my guest is Tim Akinbo. Tim, welcome in Kryptoplebs show.
Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah, okay. Can you tell us something about you? Can you give us some background and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Tim Akinbo, and I'm a Nigerian. I was born there, and I am attending this conference here in Prague called Pizza Day, and interesting enough, I got invited to come and speak here, and I brought the perspective of how Bitcoin adoption has actually occurred over the years in Africa, and I think it was necessary to kind of give people who may not actually be very conversant with how Bitcoin actually became such a force in Africa, some insight into how that occurred, and possibly give them a lot of points and things to think about, about how we should view global adoption of Bitcoin. Every society is going to have different things that they are actually interested in or concerned about, and having that more encompassing viewpoint about how Bitcoin is being used, I think, is valuable.
Yes, this will be our main topic. This is my general question for every guest. What does the money mean for you?
The money means for me freedom, right? So part of the reasons why I got attracted to Bitcoin in the first place really has to do with some of the problems that I was experiencing much earlier. So I first got online very early, in the early 2000s. And like I've said, to a lot of people who are very curious about how I learned about Bitcoin very early, I had certain problems that I was experiencing coming from the part of the world that I come from, just being able to participate online. So it's more than just being able to click on a website and read sports scores or read news articles. If you wanted to engage in any kind of economic activity, you need to have access to a financial system that can be used for settling payments. And my experience was that I didn't have access to a lot of that growing up. Early on, in my internet journey, and the very few ones that I was able to gain access to got shut down, right? So, for example, I talk about the story of eGold, how eGold was one of those platforms where it was quite convenient to receive and make payments. But over time, they had issues. They fell into certain problems with the US government, and they got shut down. And several months later, or even years later, when I read about Bitcoin, the thing that really struck out for me was how it was non-discriminatory, right? And for me, that was kind of like the reason why I got really interested in Bitcoin. It was really about how Bitcoin could be an instrument for freedom.
Okay, that's the common answer, that money is freedom.
Yeah.
Can you tell us something about Bitcoin adoption in Africa, for example, from 2016 to present?
Yeah.
And why is the Bitcoin important for people in Africa? generally?
So, you know how I talk about how Bitcoin to me represents freedom? Where I come from, there is a lot of financial repression, right? So it's more than just our ability to be able to send money and receive money internationally, which is a big problem in itself. But you know, there are other problems, which includes even things like just being able to send money, you know, across borders. So it would shock you to know that the way the financial systems in Africa are kind of structured, and I guess really just because of how the legacy financial infrastructure has been developed in the first place, is that financial flows, even between African countries, generally involve the use of correspondent banks, which might otherwise be hosted outside of the continent, right? So you might even have, so this is actually even one of the things that actually boggles me a lot, where you have a bank that has a branch in another country, and in order to send money from one branch in one country to another branch in another country, it still has to go through a correspondent bank outside of the country, right? And you would also kind of see this too in how the internet infrastructure also was built, right? So a lot of things like, you know, peering is only just beginning to become a thing where ISPs that have, you know, communication that might actually just flow from one ISP to the other now goes through certain peering hubs. Prior to this time, when an ISP wants to get internet connectivity, they just connect to one of the international backbone pipes. And generally, you would say if you want to send an email from one country to another, it has to transit through London, for example, right? These are things that didn't make a lot of sense, but economically, I guess it made sense that, you know, rather than me having to peer with like 1,000 different ISPs that might be located, how much traffic am I exchanging? It might just make sense to just connect to one pipe internationally and, you know, everyone sorts themselves out. The same thing too kind of applies with the financial network. And so we started to see lots of things kind of develop over time where we had very tight capital controls, things like money debasement. And so for some people, right, what we've noticed is that people have started to kind of ask questions. And when they begin to ask questions and they're seeking answers, Bitcoin becomes one of the answers that they discover. And little by little, you know, as someone would say, gradually and then suddenly, Bitcoin has now become a major topic of conversation across lots of people who are actually on the continent.
Right. So you are consider Bitcoin as more as a payment system or store of value? Because like you said, the people in Africa suffer from double-digit inflation, and there are some financial restriction. You can't receive or send money abroad. So is this things issues that Bitcoin solve?
To a large extent, yes. So you did mention, how is Bitcoin used? Is it more as a means of payment or is it used as a store of value? I think for a lot of people, their introduction to Bitcoin really comes from how Bitcoin allows them to skirt around restrictions, right? So if they want to either receive money or they want to send money, and the existing financial infrastructure either does not support what kinds of payments they want to make, or it's too expensive, or in some cases, it's not available for them to use in the first place. In search of solutions, right? Bitcoin actually comes as one of those potential solutions. And a lot of people get to start using Bitcoin just as a means of payment. But you see, it goes beyond just as a means of payment. When they use Bitcoin for the first time, you know, there's always that, I'm using this new technology, I'm not certain how it works. I don't know if it's actually going to work. But then, because of necessity, they are forced to use it, and it works. And then they try it again, it works. Eventually, they kind of develop a certain confidence in the technology. And I think what eventually leads them in the exploration of what can this thing do, what exactly is this thing, coupled with the fact that there is such a very low trust for institutions in general, I think a lot of people develop their savvy to the point where they consider Bitcoin as a store of value as well. So, I mean, classic example will be if someone really wants to be able to protect their wealth. And you know, one of the things about when I talk about debasement of money is year in, year out, you see that your money is buying less and less and less. You know, someone is going to start asking questions, why is this happening? And I think for a lot of people, when they start to compare the fact that their national currencies is losing value, and then they look at this alternative currency that seems to gain value, yes, we recognize that the value might be volatile sometimes, but they look at it and they're like, okay, this thing has been around. You know, it's not just a 2-year-old technology, it's a technology that is over a decade old now. It starts to build this Lindy effect that eventually leads them to trust it more and more. You know, so eventually some people start to make that bold move to say, okay, I may not trust it completely to be able to move my entire wealth into it, but then Bitcoin is such that you don't need to put your entire wealth in it for you to actually experience the benefits. And just so that, you know, I don't get accused of trying to shill Bitcoin as, you know, it means to get wealthy, I don't think that's the point, really. It's not really about you getting rich overnight. It's really just about protecting your purchasing power, right? And I think that a lot of people start to see it like it might be volatile, but I think ultimately, as compared to maybe using some other national currency, it has its own staying power, and I can kind of rely on it to protect my savings.
I think that's the main reason between Africa and the Western world, because here is a relatively good banking system. We have bank accounts, yeah, there is almost everything okay. So if you buy Bitcoin, we just want to hold it and maybe waiting for a better price. But a lot of people don't spend the Bitcoin, for example, in case of Gresham law. But I think in Africa, that's another case. And there you have to spend the Bitcoin because you have to make some payments here. So I think that's the main reason. And what do you think about the difference between West world and Africa about using Bitcoin?
Yeah. Like you said, I think you're right, actually. The use case here in the West is really about buying Bitcoin and holding it forever, right? I mean, that's like diamond hands. But I think, you know, what we see in terms of how Africans are using Bitcoin, I would say majorly, people use Bitcoin, you know, as a means to skirt around, you know, restrictions. And, you know, when I talk about restrictions, I don't mean that they're trying to break the law or what have you, but I'm talking about the fact that a lot of these people don't have a choice. You know, it boils down to how am I going to feed my family if I don't get a way to pay my supplier who is going to import cars and allow me to be able to sell to make an income, then I'm left with no choice but to look for whatever solution works for me, right? And so as a result of needing a solution to be able to move capital in and out of the country, a lot of people have actually even made the work of exchanging between national currencies and Bitcoin as a primary source of income for them. You know, not everyone is technically savvy enough to be able to, you know, understand what the ones and the A's and, you know, what a Bitcoin address should look like, or, you know, a lot of people don't necessarily need that. I just want to be able to send money to my supplier in China so I can import things that I can sell locally. And, you know, my cousin tells me of this guy who can help me do it. And, you know, I have a conversation with him or her, And she tells me, okay, you know, how much do you want to send? Oh, I want to send this amount in yuan to China. And it's like, okay, I'll get it done for you. This is the exchange rate. And I look at it, I compare it with my, you know, cost in running business. I'm like, okay, I think as compared to not being able to do that, I think that's something I could actually work with. And they've created an industry out of this where they actually become facilitators for helping people to make payments. I mean, I've heard about stories where it's virtually between life and death, where you have certain families who have children who are schooling abroad, and they can't source foreign exchange in order to pay their fees. And then my child is at the risk of actually being expelled from school because they've not been able to pay their fees. What solution is out there? And, you know, people step in to kind of like fill in that void, right, for that kind of service. So it might be something that is a luxury here where, you know, you have that discretionary income to be able to say, you know, I'm going to invest in Bitcoin and I hope the value goes up tomorrow. But for some people, it's literally a lifesaver, you know, where they'll be unable to do the kinds of things or run the kinds of businesses they are running if not for Bitcoin.
Is there any other option to solve these issues, for example, just locally, instead of Bitcoin, like mobile payments or something like this?
Yeah, I mean, payments work for local transactions. And local transactions are not really a problem. I mean, we have cash, which you can use for settling payments. But the real utility for Bitcoin really comes when there's a need for them to either make international payments where either the infrastructure doesn't exist, or it's exorbitantly expensive, or it's not even available to them. And so that's where, you know, Bitcoin really kind of provides a solution that, frankly, there's little or no other alternatives that exist.
There's a really good application called Machankura 8333, and it's an application for sending Bitcoin on the old version of mobile with it's not a smartphone, it's the old version, and I think that's the great example about the difference between Africa and the West world, because in West world we have only smartphones, but in Africa you have the old version of these phones, and I think in Western world it's nonsense, but in Africa I think it's like a game changer.
Yes.
Yeah, sending Bitcoin with on these devices.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you tried it?
I have.
Yeah,
I have.
It's really cool.
It's such a great product because you can see the thought that went into it. You know, we keep talking about Bitcoin adoption. How are we going to get Bitcoin into the hands of, you know, the global South? How are we going to get people who, you know? So let me actually give you a little bit more insight into the problem. It's not as though Africans don't have access to smartphones. You know, smartphones are actually growing in terms of penetration in the continent. But you see, it's not enough that you have a smartphone. There are all these services that need to accompany the smartphone in order for the smartphone to be useful, right? So you have instances where, for example, despite the fact that you have access to a smartphone, your internet connection is extremely slow, that it makes using some of these, you know, wallets that are, you know, internet-based, nearly impractical to use. And then you now have this issue where, okay, you have those who are able to afford smartphones have smartphones, and then you still have the vast majority of the population who, despite being able to afford a phone, it's just a feature phone that doesn't have all these smartphone features. That doesn't mean that they should be excluded from using Bitcoin. And I think that's where Machankura is actually a very, very smart solution, because you can also use it on smartphones, right? So you now have this great common denominator that works both on smartphones and feature phones. So suddenly now it's possible for you to send and receive Bitcoin to virtually any mobile phone. And, you know, mobile phone penetration is growing at, you know, a very incredible rate in Africa. And that makes it possible for a very huge population to be able to access Bitcoin services.
Great.
So I think Machankura is actually, and I'm really proud, to say that, it's a product that was developed within the continent, which kind of demonstrates people scratching their own itch, because that's really how Bitcoin is going to grow, to the other 3 billion within the planet. It's when people who live in areas who understand the technology can develop custom solutions that works in their own context. I think one of the really, really big things about Bitcoin is how permissionless it is. KG doesn't need anyone's permission in order to build Machankura. And I think that kind of demonstrates why these kinds of solutions are things that we should celebrate and try and encourage others to do.
Exactly. What's the main gate to buy Bitcoin in Africa? I think, do you have some exchanges there, or you were talking yesterday about local Bitcoin. So if I'm in Africa and I want to buy a Bitcoin, what should I do?
Well, that's a problem that I hope will get easier and easier to solve. Right now, I think the vast majority of platforms that make it easy for people to buy Bitcoin, they have certain hurdles you have to scale in order to be able to use them. So I was talking about how a very huge population within the continent do not have government-issued IDs. And one of the requirements for getting on some of these platforms, we talk about KYC, is that you have to show a government-issued ID as a form of identification. Say, this is who I am, this is recognized by my government. And then in some cases, you also have to prove that you reside at a particular address. Now, for a lot of people, someone asked me earlier this morning, like, okay, I heard you yesterday say lots of people don't have government-issued IDs. What about birth certificates? And I was like, I know it might be tough for you to hear this, but a lot of people are born in Africa who do not have birth certificates. And a lot of them actually go through their entire lives without needing one or even getting one, right? Just because the very informal nature in which a lot of structures within the society are actually set up, they don't require those things. So we talk about how a lot of financial institutions, a lot of financial non-governmental organizations are trying to bank the unbanked. And you realize that what that means in order to bank the unbanked is that they need to get IDs, because this is kind of like a requirement for them to get into the financial system, the formal financial system. And so because of those kind of restrictions, it makes it really difficult for just about anyone to be able to acquire Bitcoin on some of these platforms. Now, the good thing about Bitcoin is that the technology, despite the fact that we've built structures that require permission in order to be able to use them, Bitcoin itself does not require permission. It's peer-to-peer, it's permissionless. And so you can acquire Bitcoin if, as an African, I'm like, okay, look, I really want to acquire Bitcoin for so and so reasons. You would find informal networks where you can acquire Bitcoin peer-to-peer, right? And some of them might require that you have to trust the counterparty, but of course, the better thing to do is to find out from your own immediate social network, and I don't mean like Facebook or, this thing, but your own social circle, if any of the people that you know directly either can buy and sell Bitcoin, or they know someone that they trust that they can buy Bitcoin or sell Bitcoin to, right? And, with the rate at which the adoption is spreading, I think that, a time is going to come when, most people wouldn't actually need exchanges in order to buy and sell Bitcoin.
So it's really on peer-to-peer base.
Yes. Yeah. I think that there is the component that is not necessarily peer-to-peer, but there is a huge component as well that is peer-to-peer.
Great. And what about the local Bitcoins? I think they are shut down a few months ago,
Yes.
maybe half a year.
Yeah.
But what about these kind of services? Is it useful?
It is useful, especially when you are. So, for example, I mentioned you find out from your own social circle if anyone you know sells or buys Bitcoin. Sometimes you might not have anyone in your social circle, and that's where platforms like Local Bitcoins, which has sadly shut down, but there are also other platforms like that where you can discover other people who sell and buy Bitcoin. I think the service that these platforms offer, which is valuable, is the component of trust, right? So a lot of times when it has to do with a peer-to-peer transaction, there's always that element of who goes first, who's going to start the process of making payments. And the person who does that has to trust that once they have made the payment, that the other person is going to make good on their promise. And this is where those platforms kind of really play an important role, because they provide escrow services that then makes it such that you don't have to trust your counterparty in order to conduct a transaction. You start the transaction, you have an agreement, the Bitcoin is held in escrow, you make the payment knowing that once you fulfill the payment and you can show evidence that you have made the payment, that the other party is incentivized to let that transaction go through without it resulting in dispute. And even if there is a dispute, you have the confidence that the dispute will be resolved in your favor because you believe that you did the right thing, and that it's left to the counterparty to prove that you did not make that payment, right? So I think that's a valuable service that they offer, and I think that's one of the reasons why they have been quite popular.
Mm-hmm. Yesterday you were also saying that you were the first seller at Local Bitcoins at 2011,
2013, I think.
13, yeah. So you were the first seller of Bitcoin in
If
Africa,
I wasn't
yeah?
the first, I would probably maybe not. No, not in Africa. I think it was in my country of birth, Nigeria. I must have been maybe the first or second who would have actually started. I can say that there was nearly zero liquidity really when I started trading on local Bitcoins. Yeah.
And what about the KYC? Like you said, a lot of people have no IDs, they have no passports and no bank accounts. So almost everybody who has a Bitcoin, it's non-KYC. Am I right?
Well, some of them are KYC'd, and those will be for the people who have IDs, right? There are, for those who are enlightened, who probably have been to school, more likely than not, they have some form of government ID, because, I mean, to a large extent, you might not be able to enroll in school if you don't have one, right? Not to even talk about maybe opening a bank account, which a lot of these transactions, occur. And so the KYC, non-KYC Bitcoin, it is possible, even if you have a form of ID, to actually acquire Bitcoin, peer-to-peer, where you don't need KYC. Now, the KYC thing, some people, some traders, for example, might be concerned about who they are trading with. So they just want to be sure that, this person. So, of course, when you have a system that, there is some lack of structure, there is the potential for criminals to take advantage of that, right? So sometimes someone might get scammed, or someone tries to use a hacked bank account to buy Bitcoin, and it could put the counterparty in trouble if someone buys Bitcoin from you using a hacked bank account. So you might see situations where, if I don't know you, and there is no establishment of trust between the two of us, I might demand to see some form of ID that proves who you are. And of course, I would expect that whatever payments you're making is coming from a bank account that is in your name, right? So, but outside of that, I would say, yeah, there are lots of ways through which people are able to acquire Bitcoin, either through the KYC means or the non-KYC means.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Nigeria. According to Google search, the Bitcoin term is the most searching word in Nigeria, I think, from 2016 to present, except 2021. where was first the El Salvador, but the Nigeria is dominate in this term of searching. So, what do you think is the main reasons for this?
So, first of all, I would say that 1 in every 5 black people you see out there is a Nigerian, right?
Okay.
It's the most populous black nation in the world. So in terms of search results, you know, if everyone as a percentage of the population were searching for Bitcoin in different African countries, Nigeria would be one of the highest, okay? So that might translate to why we have such high search results. But that's not to say that there's not a very huge interest in Bitcoin. So, I mean, every person I know personally who is a Nigerian has heard of Bitcoin. I don't, you know, even if I went to my mother and you asked my mother, oh, do you know Bitcoin? Yeah, my mom would probably tell you more about Bitcoin, you know, than a lot of Europeans, I would say. And that's just probably because of a lot of things, right? So you rightly mentioned that the search results kind of spiked in 2016, 2017. Part of the reason was for legitimate reasons. Like, you know, I've heard about this Bitcoin thing. Someone has told me about it. You know, it's been on the news. People are talking about how they're getting rich, you know, like crazily rich using Bitcoin because they invested in Bitcoin. And they are curious about what this Bitcoin thing is. So obviously they're turning to the internet, trying to figure out more about what Bitcoin is really all about. Secondly, around that same time too, we also had, you know, the development of a lot of scams that were kind of based on Bitcoin. So they kind of leveraged on the very huge interest that Bitcoin had and started to make promises about, you know, outsized gains and returns. And the term that was being spread around was, you know what has happened to Bitcoin? You know, people who discovered it several years ago have become incredibly rich. This is the next Bitcoin, right? And they're trying to get people to kind of invest in those scams because they're promising that, look, it's riding on the same technology, you know, and probably maybe they might even count certain attributes of that particular project as being better than Bitcoin. And, you know, people who feel like they missed the boat on Bitcoin will be thinking, wow, if I have another opportunity to invest in the next Bitcoin, I should definitely not let this opportunity pass. And I think that also kind of really drove a lot of people to kind of like, okay, I want to find the next Bitcoin, you know, and a lot of people got scammed, sadly, lost their life savings. People are still kind of reeling from a lot of those scams. I mean, I was talking with someone recently about the lunar crash and how it affected a lot of Africans. I know people who were completely wiped out because of that. I mean, you know, over the years, we've seen lots of scams involving altcoins and different tokens and ICOs. People kind of learned from that, you know, where, okay, don't invest in anything you think, you know, when they come and they tell you it's going to go 100x, come and invest in this completely made up thing. They've gotten smart about it. But then, you know, there's this promise of a stable coin that is pegged somewhat, even if it's algorithmically, to the US dollar. But that's not the only feature. It also enjoys a certain yield. I think at one point it was like 20% APY, thereabout. And the only smart thing people could think of is, look, this is as good as the US dollar, and you're getting a yield on top of it, right? Now, nobody actually asks questions, how exactly are you getting the yield? But, you know, they were sold on the idea that it was as good as the US dollar. And imagine, you know, that you put $1 into this thing and within a year, you're getting $1.20. It only made sense, you know, for people who thought they were smart and, you know, who didn't do proper due diligence to invest in it. And a lot of people actually kind of realizing that it was as good as the dollar, put their entire life savings into it. And when the whole thing came crashing and they realized that nothing was back in UST, you know, they lost everything. People are still kind of picking up the pieces from the destruction that happened as a result of that. But these are the things that kind of like also drive a lot of interest, I would say, in the whole thing. So Bitcoin being a very popular thing in Nigeria has been contributed to by quite a number of things. You know, genuine interest in Bitcoin itself, how it can be used, both as a means for savings or for payments, you know, mostly, but also just people trying to speculate on one thing or the other, and they think everything is Bitcoin. You know, is what must have driven a lot of interest in that.
It's a branding story.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. What about CBDC in Nigeria? There is some kind of e-naira, I think. Can you tell us something about it?
Sure. So I can only, you know, tell you as much as I understand about the CBDC. The e-naira project, I would think it's about 2 years old now. So prior to this, central bankers around the world have been mulling the idea of some kind of blockchain or distributed ledger technology application for money. Seeing the success of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, it was really only a matter of time before people start to think, okay, I really don't like the fact that we can't control Bitcoin. But what if we could actually use the same technology for something we control, right? And, you know, you have a lot of CBDC consultants, you know, going from one country to the other, trying to sell, you know, whatsoever kind of solution that they can provide central bankers, you know, to be able to leverage this technology and create a digital currency that is controlled by the central bank. And I think a lot of central banks saw the appeal and the benefits that they would be able to have if they could roll out a central bank digital currency. And Nigeria was, or the Nigerian central bank, was one of the central bankers who was curious about the technology. And I think they went through several months of consultations. Eventually, they decided that they were going to pull the trigger and actually release a CBDC. I don't think, they thought about maybe having a trial. I think it was more of a thing like, okay, we're confident about this technology. Let's roll it out and let's get people using it, right? Most times people, when central bankers are kind of releasing even when they're talking about concepts around CBDC deployments, there are certain conversations about, okay, what's distributed ledger technology we're going to use? Is it going to be open? Is it going to be closed? How is issuance or, redemptions for the CBDC going to occur? And in our own case, there's just so many things about the implementation that is opaque to us. It's not an open system, but all we know is that the central bank made an announcement that we are rolling out the CBDC, and it's going to be called the e-naira. It is going to represent the naira that we're used to one-to-one. So they recognized it was a different currency, but it was going to be pegged to the naira, and as such, because it was being backed by the central bank, there was a promise that it was going to be redeemed or redeemable for naira, wherever it is that you want to use it. So they rolled it out, and of course, with every rollout, you have to think of all the different stakeholders who are involved. Commercial banks had to be on board. I wouldn't say that they were on board out of choice, but the regulator says you have to support this, and they're left with no choice but to support it. And in my opinion, it was a colossal failure, right? Why do I say so? First and foremost, remember I mentioned that Africans, and I'll speak specifically for Nigerians, have a very big distrust for institutions. And the financial institution is also one of them, right? And so coming out and saying, okay, look, we're releasing this particular currency. We promised that we would redeem it one-to-one for the Naira. It wasn't just something that people bought into. Besides, the question everyone was asking is, our current financial system is working just about well. Why do we need a CBDC, right? And because there wasn't really any use case, any really compelling reason to use the CBDC, I think that the rollout itself just kind of fell flat on its face. At a point, I figured that the central bank thought that maybe the commercial banks weren't really trying to help with the adoption, and they tried to send memos around to kind of require that the banks promote it. But again, it's not really in the interest of the commercial banks to push a CBDC. Why? Because commercial banks, they provide a service by helping people who need to obtain loans, who want to be able to make payments, to be able to do so. By the time you introduce a CBDC, a lot of those functions will be removed from them. And I don't see a reason why commercial banks will be very excited to promote a CBDC. So it's understandable that maybe they didn't do enough to try and promote it. But as it stands today, the e-Naira is still something that anyone who is interested in using it would be able to use it. But I don't know any actual metron points where you can pay with your e-Naira. And, as it is right now, I think it's just a rollout that has failed. The central bank might disagree with me, but it's in the proof of usage, and I don't think that it's being used by enough people for it to say it's been successful.
This is my next question. Do you think it can survive in long term? Because, like you said, a lot of people have no bank account,
yeah,
and the main form of payment is cash. Mm-hmm. So there is it's a very inefficient system, right?
Yeah. Again, the e-Naira is digital technology. It's hard enough to get people to use cryptocurrencies, not to mention using CBDCs, right? Even though, I guess for some people who kind of trust the Naira and are used to using the Naira, it might be something that they might be more open to actually using. But I figure that a lot of that isn't happening because one too many times the financial regulator has broken the trust of the people. And so I don't think anyone is going to enthusiastically embrace that technology thinking that, okay, everything is going to work well. I'm sure some people will be thinking, okay, what's really the end game here? What are some of the risks that I might be exposing myself to if I use this? And so that general distrust that the people have for the financial institution generally is what will keep them away from probably using it. Yeah.
What about the political situation in Nigeria? I saw some videos, again, 1 year ago, I think. There was some police brutality against people, and the people said that very often the police stole the money from them. So they really recommended that use Bitcoin because there is something they cannot steal from you. Also, they even don't know that you have a Bitcoin. So is it against some use case for Bitcoin?
Okay, so what you're actually describing is a protest that happened a few years ago called the NSARS protest.
Yeah.
Right? So
that's it.
This protest actually came as a result of excessive police brutality that mostly young people were experiencing, right? So, for no reason, just because your hair is cut a certain way, or because you have an iPhone, or you have access to a laptop or something, just maybe because you're demonstrating or you're displaying certain items that might be considered something only very wealthy people will do, certain people might be accused of being criminals. And as a result, rather than go through due process of, okay, let's assume that there is any suspicion, there is due process for investigations, right? But most of the times, this is accompanied with a lot of brutality. People have actually lost their lives as a result of some of these actions by law enforcement. And so, it got to a point where people, especially young people, said, enough is enough, right? We demand change, and we're going to let our grievances known. And so they started to protest, end SARS. And SARS actually is a division of the police force that SARS is actually an acronym for Special Anti-Robbery Squad. And their job really is to tackle, criminal elements of the society that are generally involved in armed robberies. And what we ended up seeing was, rather than focus on, what the unit has been created for, they started terrorizing young people just because their hair was, shaped a certain way, or they were dressed a certain way. And, this kind of led to a very significant dissatisfaction that led to those protests. So in order to kind of like show solidarity, some people actually started organizing fundraisers to raise some money, to support the people who are protesting, and that there should be a change. We can't keep on, having our young ones actually terrorized of going out into the public, of being tortured or even killed just because they look a certain way. What actually happened eventually was that the central bank wasn't really happy that the protests were kind of gaining steam and they were being successful. Usually when this protest starts, there's always the assumption that they'll run out of steam. Just give them some time, they'll run out of steam, and then everybody's going to go back home and, they'll forget that anything like this ever happened. But, it happened the first day, second day, third day. It looked like it wasn't going to stop, right? And so in order to kind of like find the different weak spots within the movement, if we're going to call it that, and try and nip it in the bud, they only saw that it kept growing. So, okay, how are we going to tackle this? Okay, let's cut off their access to the financial system. So a lot of these organizations that were doing the fundraisers, they had their bank accounts frozen. And so suddenly they were out of funds and they could not continue to support the protesters. A group of people were smart enough to figure that, okay, we've always heard about Bitcoin as being this money that cannot be censored, that cannot be shut off, that, you can have access to, and that no one will be able to deprive you access of being able to use it. Why don't we use the technology this time around to see if we can actually get around this restriction? And so they set up, a donation site for accepting Bitcoins. And they were back on track. People were donating from all around the world. And the movement was they were able to sustain the protests, right, using Bitcoin. And one of the things that really, this was a very pivotal moment in the country, especially for young people who were able to see that, hey, look, our bank accounts got shut down, but we turned to Bitcoin and they have not been able to shut this down. And for a lot of people who might have been sitting on the sidelines or who called Bitcoin a scam initially, they were able to see how Bitcoin really was something that was a force of its own. And I think that really contributed to people actually gaining some level of trust in Bitcoin. And that actually gave Bitcoin some credibility that still exists till this day.
Yeah, it reminds me of the protestation in Canada.
Yes.
I think it was the beginning of 2021, where the truckers protest against vaccination. and a lot of people want to fund them, and they're trying to just send money. It was through GoFundMe, I think, service, but the government stops the payments and froze the accounts of the trackers, and it was pretty interesting. And of course, they tried Bitcoin, and with the Bitcoin, it was okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any possibilities to hedge against inflation in Africa? Invest to any assets, for example, real estate, stock market, or maybe some precious metals?
Those assets actually do exist. And some people are actually able to use real estate. I think is actually really big. You know, most people will tell you, look, real estate is something that doesn't go down in value. That may not necessarily be true, but in the context of the currency, I think a lot of people over time, and this is not something that was built through 1 or 2 years or half a decade. This is something that has been built, you know, through decades. And so the general word of wisdom is that if you have the ability to acquire real estate, you should, because that might just be something that might prevent you from being poor and also leave something as an inheritance to, you know, the future generation. The unfortunate thing is that a lot of people are very poor. Right? They are only just able to feed themselves, you know, from their monthly income. And so real estate is not something that they can easily access because it's capital intensive. We don't have structures like mortgages that are easily accessible. So, I mean, for most people, okay, you can just, all you have to do is just save 10 or 20%, make the down payment, and you can get a loan from the bank to finance your property purchase. But it's not something that is easily accessible for a number of reasons. One, it's not like a lot of people have credit histories that the bank can say, okay, this person is credit worthy and we can lend them the money. And then secondly, even in situations where you have credit history, the interest rates on the loans are just ridiculous, that it just doesn't make any sense for you to take a loan from the bank to build a house, especially a house that you're going to live in. And so most people who acquire property would have saved the entire amount in order to be able to do so. So that's real estate. Then we talk about other assets, like stocks, like maybe alternative investment vehicles. While these exist, it takes a very significant amount of savvy and investment knowledge in order to be able to invest in them. There aren't, say, fixed deposit accounts that pay a reasonable amount in interest that will make it worthwhile. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a fixed deposit account that can give you 14% returns a year. Now, if you had 14% a year here in Europe, you know, this would be like the best investment ever. But here's the problem. You have an investment vehicle that is going to pay out 14% a year, but inflation is running at 22%. If you do the math, you're still losing money. And so what ends up happening is that most people just learn that the best way to survive is to spend all the money you have acquiring whatever things you need. So if it's food and you have sufficient income, buy food in bulk and keep it at home. If you have any intentions of acquiring a car, save up the money, buy the car and have it, because prices are just going to keep going up. And so it kind of creates this environment where there's very high time preference. Yes. You have to get everything right now because it's going to get more expensive in the future. So in terms of how do people protect their wealth, what instruments or vehicles are available for them to be able to do so, there is very, very little that is available or accessible for them to use. And I might argue, or someone will argue, okay, what about Bitcoin? Well, it turns out Bitcoin is available, and the good thing is you can buy as little or as much as you want. However, it's only when someone has sufficient discretionary income where it's like, okay, after all my expenses, there is still a little left over that I can consider investing, is when they can actually kind of consider these options, right? So in terms of avenues through which people can save, very little exists. And that's why it's such a big problem, because everyone really starts to think that the money itself is no good because it can be relied on to be a good store of value.
Yes. In this case, what about stable coins in Africa? I think the stable coins are using in Latam, especially in Venezuela. And do you think that the people want the properties of cryptocurrency, but they are afraid of volatility? Yeah? They want to avoid it, so they are deciding to buy, for example, Tether or USDC, whatever, and use it instead of Bitcoin, because, like you said, you have to pay bills, you have to send money abroad, but the Bitcoin is volatile, and so in this case, I decided to purchase the stable coin instead of Bitcoin. So what about the stable coins in Nigeria or in Africa generally?
So, if you know the history of stable coins, before we had stable coins, we've always had all kinds of altcoins, right? So stable coins are quite recent invention. And I think what we're seeing is that more and more people are beginning to turn towards stable coins for a number of reasons. So the first reason is that, so one thing that we could have talked about in terms of how are people protecting their wealth is some of them consider buying the US dollar, right? So, if I have some spare cash that I don't need, and I'm concerned that, the exchange rate against the dollar is just going to keep going up, it's going to keep losing more and more value, I might decide that I'm going to buy US dollars and keep. And then I would convert that US dollars into Naira if I need it in the future. So it's something a lot of people who have that, again, discretionary income are actually doing. This is something that is being practiced on a daily basis. Right? Sometimes we have the central bank coming out and saying things like, those of you who are speculating on the US dollar, you guys are going to be shocked when, demand falls through the ground, and the US dollars you thought were going to be worth so much in Naira, now become worth very little. Now, I don't know if it's really in the place of the central bank to make those kind of utterances, because people are only just trying to survive. They're trying to protect what little wealth they're able to create and earn. So it's really not their fault that one of the things that they have thought about doing is acquiring some US dollars as a way to protect against further currency devaluation. But what is happening now is even getting access to those physical US dollars is becoming more and more restricted, right? Up until recently, and by recently, I don't mean like this year, I mean probably maybe early last year, it was rather easy for you to actually go out to the streets, meet a money changer, and buy US dollars. Now it's becoming increasingly difficult because the central bank will not have, they have decided that they're not going to sell US dollars to licensed, bureau de changes, right? Companies that are officially allowed to perform the role of doing money exchanges. So now, the only way these businesses are able to acquire dollars is if someone actually sells to them, right? They don't have any other extra source of liquidity. Now, if you see that the demand for dollars just keeps increasing and increasing and increasing, why would you go and sell your US dollars to, a money changer? You're more likely going to be incentivized to hold on to the dollars you have because it's becoming more and more increasingly valuable. And so that creates a very huge supply shock on the availability of US dollars. And I'm talking about physical US dollars. And so if you don't have access to physical US dollars, you might consider having access to digital US dollars. And this is where stable coins are becoming increasingly a channel for people to access US dollar liquidity. Now, again, part of the reason why USD was such a massive wealth destroyer was just alternatives for getting access to US exposure, US dollar exposure.
So it was the main reason to purchase USD because it has 20%.
Yes, obviously,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not just a stable coin like Tether, for example, that didn't pay any yield on top of it. And so, you know, without doing proper research, you learn that there's something that is also like Tether, but it also pays you externally. Of course, that would be more attractive. And I think it's one of the reasons why stable coins have increasingly become more popular amongst the population. I would not characterize my colleagues as being the typical Nigerian person, but I have heard, you know, from some of my colleagues that the way they play the game now is whatever liquidity they need for, you know, the next 30 days expenditure, they might have that in the local currency, in their bank account. For something that they need for, you know, more medium-term usage, they would have that in stable coins. And for something that they're looking like multi-year kind of savings, long-term savings, they'll have that in Bitcoin. So you're seeing this very interesting dynamic where people are considering using different assets to not only protect their wealth against long-term devaluation, but they're also looking at short-term devaluation as well, where, okay, I don't know what's going to happen within the next month, so let me protect my wealth. And I don't need that volatility. I know, you know, Bitcoin is volatile, but it's also volatile mostly to the upside.
Yes.
But if I need it for, you know, 2-3 months down the line, the value might drop, right? So, and that's not a very good position to be in. So for more long-term kind of savings, I'm seeing people do a lot of Bitcoin savings. For more medium-term kind of purchase planning, they have it in stable coins, and then they only use Naira for very short-term cash needs.
So do you consider stable coins like the potential gate to Bitcoin?
I think it's an alternative. I think both of them are kind of considered as cryptocurrencies, but with different properties. So it's not particularly like a gateway towards Bitcoin. I think it's just its own thing that has its own specific use case, while Bitcoin is its own thing as well that has its own particular use case.
Okay, and just tell me something about altcoins like, for example, Cardano. Maybe you heard that Hoskinson, I think, he said that he would do the revolution of Cardano in Africa and the things like this.
Yeah.
Do you consider as a good idea, or it's just another scam?
I mean, you know, in my own little circles, they call me a Bitcoin maximalist because. And it's not because, you know, I kind of like proclaim myself to be one, but I think it's just, you know, when I kind of poke holes at certain arguments and try to get people to explain their position, it's kind of, yeah, you're always kind of like finding a way to make Bitcoin as being the superior argument in everything. And a lot of times I try to understand, like, where's the utility? What utility is being provided here? Is this really a problem that this particular solution or this particular technology provides a solution to? Or is it just wishful thinking, right? I think, as is with, you know, Cardano is not the only project that is trying to do something in Africa. There is a particular project that was going to roll out in Senegal. I think it was called Akon City.
Akon,
So
yeah.
and I had this Akon coin, and I don't know what ever happened, you know, to that particular project. But there was a time when, you know, it was all the rave, and you know, it's like there was just a lot of hype around it. But we've seen these things come, we've seen these things go, right? And I know sometimes some of the people who promote these projects are doing so from a place of pure intentions, right? But I think intentions alone are not sufficient really to justify one particular project or the other. And this is why I kind of, part of the reason why I try as much as possible not to be the person who is always trying to push Bitcoin as being, Bitcoin fixes this, Bitcoin fixes everything. Because the honest truth is that Bitcoin doesn't fix everything. If someone has her health failing because she doesn't have access to proper medical facilities where she can get proper treatment, I don't see how Bitcoin is an immediate solution to that problem. I don't see how Bitcoin fixes that. So Bitcoin doesn't of itself fix everything. And so I think a lot of these projects that have lots of claims on the kinds of things they are hoping to achieve, I think at the end of the day, we kind of just realize that most of them are just vaporware. Lots of claims, but at the end of the day, what ends up being the real use case in those cases? And I think what we've seen time and time again is, people always come up with all kinds of projects on how this is going to fix this problem and how we're going to revolutionize this and that. And I think we need more people who would ask the really hard questions. How is this going to happen? And it has to make sense. When I first discovered Bitcoin, I had my doubts. Like, I was really critical about whether or not it was going to work. But when I actually kind of used it and I was able to prove for myself that this is not actually a scam, it was obvious to me what the problems it was trying to solve were. It wasn't something I needed someone to just tell me, look, Bitcoin is going to fix the inflation problem, is going to do this, is going to do that. I had to see it for myself and I had to question it. And I think we need more people having that critical mindset where they poke holes until whatever solution it is that is being sold or marketed to them is able to, withstand all those criticism and, come out successful at the end. So I think that's what needs to happen more of.
Yes. In the last year, there was African conference 2022. I think this is the biggest event in Africa about Bitcoin. And this year, there should be again the conference in Ghana.
Yeah.
It will be in December, I think. Mm-hmm. So it likes that the Bitcoin gaining traction by these conferences, right?
I think so. So one of the really good things about the kind of approach I think the African Bitcoin Conference has taken is it's not just going to be an event where, Bitcoin users or Bitcoin adopters or Bitcoiners in general just come to celebrate and, network with each other. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend the last one. I'm really hopeful that I'll attend the one this year. But it's more about getting people who are the people who really need this technology to attend these events. So when we talk about activists, for example, who are, a very, very important group of people who need a technology like this, encouraging them to attend events like this and learning about the technology, having an avenue where they could ask all the questions they want to ask and have the answers they need, seeing people who can actually help them use the tools that they need to be able to use, I think that's when I would consider such an event a success. Not just Bitcoiners talking to other Bitcoiners, but really an avenue through which people who really need this technology have an avenue to actually learn to use this technology.
Mm-hmm. There are also another community project and education center like ECASI, which is something like El Zonte from El Salvador.
Yes.
And it's aiming to make a like a circular economy with Bitcoin. So can you tell us something about it?
I don't know so much about the Bitcoin nechápou project personally, but from a lot of the things that I've read about it, learned about it from other people. You see, the thing about Bitcoin is people need to get really comfortable with it. And I think it's one of the things that is hurting adoption, is that when people think about Bitcoin, it looks like something that is very complicated to use. I think one of the things that projects like Bitcoin Beach and Bitcoin nechápou are really helping to solve is in removing that mysticism or that complexity about how the technology itself is supposed to work. For people like you and I who have used Bitcoin before, and it's kind of easy, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? But for a lot of people, it's not a no-brainer. It's scary, to think that, all this value is just locked up in 12 or 24 words that I could lose, and someone is telling me that, once I lose those 12 words or 24 words, that's okay. That's everything.
It's okay. You can buy a ledger and he will manage it for you. Don't worry about
exactly.
it.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And what this project's actually help to achieve is that they really get Bitcoin in the hands of everyday people. Sometimes they actually go to communities where, if they never had an opportunity to have someone bring those tools and, to them, they would probably never have an opportunity to do so. So a lot of times you see that they go to beach towns, villages, very small communities, and they just try to kickstart the Bitcoin circular economy. And the whole idea is to get the people comfortable using Bitcoin itself as a currency to a point where it becomes second nature for them to say, oh, okay, it's just going to cost you 5,000 sats in order to buy my coconuts, for example. And, it starts the process, the mental process of getting really comfortable with using it, to the point where when we talk about the circular economy, it's not just about, we're trying to get the community to use Bitcoin, but it's not just about that. It's also about creating an economy where people are earning and spending Bitcoin, right? Ultimately, that's what the Bitcoin circular economy is about. It's not just we have remittances coming one way, but it's also the fact that we can create economies where Bitcoin is kind of like the currency of use, and it becomes something that the community can get comfortable with using, and not have to rely on maybe having to convert whatever cryptocurrency it is they use into fiat in order to be able to, carry out certain transactions. And once you're able to accomplish that, I think then, a lot of things can happen. And I think that's really the ultimate goal in a lot of these Bitcoin circular economy experiments, is that we're able to get to a point where the experiment does not require external stimulus in order to get it going, but that it gets to a point of critical adoption where it now becomes a thing that can run by itself.
After all we discussed right now, do you think that the main adoption of Bitcoin will come from Africa? Because, for example, here in Europe, there is, like I said, you buy Bitcoin and
yes.
A few people will also spend it, like here in Parapolis.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people also just buy Bitcoin on some shitty application, like
sure.
what's the main?
Robinhood?
Not Robinhood. I forgot it, but it's custodial.
Yeah.
That's not even a Bitcoin. It's just some derivative, and they can't send it to the wallet. Yeah, so they have it on exchange or on this application, and then they think they have Bitcoin, but they don't have Bitcoin. Yeah, so that's the Europe. Also, there was some potential banning proof of work mining cryptocurrencies in 2020, I think. And so, I mean, the adoption of Bitcoin, it's like it's the silent, it's the silent adoption.
Well,
and
I mean,
it's growing.
Yes. So I'm going to say something that, I don't know, some people might consider as controversial, I don't think it's controversial at all. You know, whether your use case is store of value or it's a means of payment, every use of Bitcoin is a use of Bitcoin. You know, whether you're buying Bitcoin just because you want to get exposure to potential wealth increase through the appreciation in the price, or you are buying Bitcoin not because you care about, its potential to go up in price, but just because that's the only way you'll be able to pay your supplier in China or in the US. Each of these different use cases are use cases for adoption, right? So whether it's more people are buying Bitcoin to get exposure, or more people are buying Bitcoin just so that they can, participate in the circular economy or just have access to a means of payment that they know, I would be able to use this to move my wealth anywhere I want to. All of these are adoption use cases. And so I think the best way to probably look at it is to see adoption happening at different fronts, right? So yes, maybe the path to adoption of Bitcoin in Africa will be different from the way it is here in Europe or in the Americas, but adoption is adoption. All we really want to see is that more people are able to use Bitcoin to solve whatever problem it is that they find as being the most important.
I agree, yes. Let's talk about it, to your project Koala, which is aiming to educate the new Bitcoin developers on Lightning, I think. So can you tell us something about it?
Yeah, so about 2.5 years ago, a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, who runs a Bitcoin company in Nigeria called BitNob, we were having a chat, and we were kind of chatting about the very poor state of Bitcoin development in Africa, right? Now, why is Bitcoin very interesting? One very important property of Bitcoin is that it's permissionless, right? And what do we mean by permissionless? It means you want to build a financial application on top of Bitcoin. You don't need to get any license from anyone. You don't need to get anyone's approval. You don't need anyone's permission in order for you to go ahead and build what you want to build on top of it. It's an open protocol. Despite the fact that we have this technology that is permissionless and anyone can build whatever it is they want to build on top of it, we realize that access to knowledge about how to do so is still lacking. I remember how I mentioned the fact that adoption of Bitcoin is going to happen in different ways, right? The path to adoption in one area of the world may be different to another area in the world. And so identifying that, okay, Africa is adopting Bitcoin. It's becoming more of a very popular thing. People are using it to solve their problems, but there are still certain problems that are not getting solved, right? We have our own peculiar ways of doing things that may not necessarily fit within how a lot of applications are built, the direction in which, things are being built, and that there is a need for certain solutions to get built. And he was running a company then, and he lamented the fact that he could not find Bitcoin developers who could help build out some of the products that he has in mind. And that was where we now started to mold the idea of setting up some kind of institute or a school that would fill that gap. I wasn't the only one who was speaking with him at the time. There were two other people as well. Two of us actually have been fellows at the Chain Code Residency Program, which basically looks for really promising developers all across the world and tries to get them to join a residency program where they can learn to build Bitcoin applications, and they can have access to very, very talented Bitcoin developers where they can, through the infusion of knowledge and ideas, can get an accelerated development process to get to a point where they have all the knowledge they need in order to be able to build Bitcoin applications or to be able to contribute to Bitcoin protocol development. Right. So because we had been through the program, we had certain ideas on how this program could look like. And last year we had our very first cohort of fellows or students who went through the program, right? And the whole idea behind the CALA program is that we want to focus on building developers who can build applications in Bitcoin. So either it's using on-chain protocol or using Lightning as a development stack. And we're being very selective about the kinds of people we enroll in the program, because at this stage, what we're trying to do is not teach people how to program, right? But get people who already know how to program and then just skill them or upskill them with Bitcoin protocol development, right? So, okay, I'm already a programmer, I have some experience. I'm interested in building for Bitcoin. How do I go about it? And so with a very short, 3 to 5 month accelerated development program, we're able to get them to a point where they're building actual projects that demonstrates mastery of the skills that they've learned during the entire course of the program. And we had about 13 people who went through the very first cohort who actually ended up working either for certain Bitcoin companies or to our great success, having people who were contributing to open source projects, some of them even with winning certain grants that allows them to be able to do that. And it's been a kind of like a testament to how much good we've been able to achieve with that. Our desire is that we get to a point where, we can have thousands of developers actually kind of going through that program and actually going out there and having the skill to be able to build the kinds of tools that the continent heavily desires to be able to push even that adoption even further. When you solve a problem that someone desperately needs, you don't need to convince them to adopt the technology. Adoption just happens automatically. And I think that our push in this direction in trying to educate African developers, because these are the people who have the problem. They understand the problem better than you would have, say, developers in other Western countries. They are best suited to create the solutions as well. And so that's kind of like what we are trying to achieve at CALA. And right now we actually have our second cohort going through. They'll be graduating within a month or two now. And, we're just going to keep going on like that. Right now we're looking at having 2 cohorts every year. And soon, we hope to have like multiple of them going on at the same time. That's the problem that we're trying to solve. And this is how we're going about it.
Great.
Yeah.
Are you working on any interesting project right now?
Not at this time.
Not this time.
Not at this time.
Okay. One more question. What's your opinion on ordinals on Bitcoin inscriptions?
I don't have an opinion. I frankly don't really care about ordinals. I have had the opportunity of speaking with some people here at the conference, and I think we've given it a little too much attention. It was always a big surprise to me, because this is not the first time really that people have tried to put data on the blockchain. We've had colored coins. Yes. We've had projects like Counterparty that uses Bitcoin, and some might argue in a way that, they don't want Bitcoin to be used. I mean, who am I to say what you should and should not use Bitcoin for? I mean, so the argument really comes from the fact that people are upset that fees are going up, and so they are sad that they can't make their 1 Satoshi per VByte transactions anymore. And I feel like, you know, I mean, when I heard for the first time that, you know, miners were able to make more from transaction fees than the subsidy on the block, you know, I looked at it as a signal that, you know, sometime in the future, really, this will become commonplace. This is a good time really to test that and to see how the market reacts to that. And I think it's a really, really big testament to how far Bitcoin has come. Mm-hmm. For me personally, why I'm not really so concerned about it is because we've had something similar to this before. You know, we had the fork wars of, or the, you know, the block size debate of 2017.
Yes, because.
And back then, we also kind of noticed that there was this period when we had like a huge backlog of transactions that were trying to get confirmed. And there wasn't any alternative way to make payments on Bitcoin except, you know, to use on-chain. But today, we are not in that situation anymore. I mean, we have other second layer technologies that we can leverage on that don't really require that, you know, you have to make an on-chain transaction. And so with technologies like Lightning, I feel like, you know, for people who still want to be able to make, you know, buy their coffee with 1 Satoshi per byte transactions, you have Lightning and you can still continue to do so, right? I think the demand for block space will only continue to increase well into the future. And Bitcoiners who are upset with ordinals need to get comfortable with the fact that it's a free market. It's permissionless, right? They don't need your permission in order to do that. And as long as they are paying the fees, they're not doing anything that is wrong, right? Now, of course, some people might have alternative opinions. And I think, you know, again, it's just your opinion, but nothing about the Bitcoin protocol is broken. It's working exactly as it has been designed.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have any recommendation or advice to our listeners about Bitcoin? Anything else? Do you want to spread some message?
Sure. I mean, if you're still on the fence where Bitcoin is concerned, you'll be doing yourself and your future self a great honor and a great service to learn everything you can about Bitcoin today. Time is not really on your side, and you really have to consider that you don't want to get in a situation in the future where you're like, I wish I had studied this Bitcoin more and understood it better.
Totally agree.
Thank you.
Okay, Tim, thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Hope you enjoy here, and
yes.
let's eat some pizza.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.